Before history ever called him a symbol, he was simply a man who trusted the law and paid for it with 12 stolen years. In 1841, Solomon Northup was a free black violinist, living in New York, a husband, a father, a citizen protected by papers and promises. One ordinary journey south for work would turn into an unthinkable nightmare. Betrayal, chains, and a descent into the brutal heart of American slavery. Sold under a false name, beaten for speaking the truth, and forced to survive on plantations where hope itself was punished, Solomon faced a reality designed to erase him completely. Yet what made his story impossible was not just that he endured but that he escaped. This is the true story of Solomon Northup, the man the system tried to bury, the escape they never believed could happen, and the testimony that exposed a nation's darkest lie and changed history forever. Solomon Northup's life as a free man in New York began not with privilege but with certainty, the rare and fragile certainty that his body, his labor, and his name belonged to him alone. Born in 1808 to Mintus Northup, a man who had once been enslaved and later freed, Solomon grew up with an understanding of freedom not as an abstract ideal but as a condition that had been earned, defended, and documented. His father carried the memory of bondage in his silence and his posture, and from him Solomon learned early that freedom in America was something that had to be proven again and again, especially for a black man. Papers mattered, names mattered, witnesses mattered. Even so, within the borders of New York, Solomon lived with a confidence shaped by law, routine, and family, a confidence that came from years of waking up unchained and going to sleep unafraid of being sold. He learned to read and write, skills that placed him in a narrow but meaningful space of independence, and he developed a talent for the violin that would become both his livelihood and his pride. Music was not merely entertainment for Solomon, it was proof of refinement, intellect, and selfhood in a society that worked relentlessly to deny those qualities to people who looked like him. With his violin he found work at dances, social gatherings, and celebrations, moving comfortably through white and black spaces alike, navigating a world that recognized him as free even if it never fully fitted him as equal. He married Anne Hampton, a woman known for her strength, skill, and quiet resolve, and together they built a household grounded in labor, cooperation, and hope. Anne worked as a cook, respected for her abilities, while Solomon balanced farming with music, their combined efforts sustaining a modest but stable life. They raised 3 children, and Solomon took seriously the responsibility of being not only a provider but a present father. He understood that his children's future depended as much on protection as on love, that the world beyond their doorstep was unpredictable and often hostile. Yet within their home there was order and purpose, evenings filled with conversation, planning, and the steady rhythms of ordinary life. Solomon moved through his days with the assurance of a man who believed that law had meaning, that citizenship, however incomplete, offered some measure of security. He carried his freedom papers with care, knowing they were shields against doubt, and he trusted that the state of New York, which had abolished slavery, stood firmly behind those documents. His social circle reflected this stability. He interacted with neighbors, fellow workers, and employers who knew him by name, who recognized his family, who could vouch for his status if ever questioned. He paid debts, fulfilled contracts, and participated in the small economies that held his community together. There was dignity in this predictability, in the repetition of seasons marked by planting and harvest, by school terms and religious gatherings. Solomon was not wealthy, but he was secure in ways that mattered most, rooted in a place where his presence was not temporary or conditioned. Freedom shaped his posture, the way he spoke, the way he expected to be treated, and though he was not naive about racism, he believed that the worst excesses of bondage belonged to the past, or to distant places beyond his daily reach. The Northup household functioned with a rhythm that depended on mutual reliance. Anne's work often required her to travel for employment, and Solomon took on increased responsibility at home during those times, managing the children, the land, and his musical engagement. This division of labor was not born of necessity alone but of trust, a shared understanding that each of them was capable and respected in their role. Solomon took pride in being seen as reliable and upright, qualities that mattered deeply in a society that searched constantly for reasons to undermine black respectability. He attended church, observed community norms, and avoided conflicts that might draw unwanted attention, not out of fear but out of a desire to preserve what he had built. Music offered him both income and connection, and through it he encountered strangers who admired his skill without questioning his humanity. At gatherings, he was introduced simply as a musician, not as a curiosity or a threat, and in those moments the promise of American freedom felt almost tangible. He could imagine a future shaped by gradual progress, by education for his children, by continued work and modest advancement. His sense of self was reinforced daily by the ordinary freedoms others took for granted, choosing where to go, negotiating his labor, returning home at night. These freedoms were not dramatic, but they were absolute in their quiet power, and Solomon internalized them so completely that he could scarcely imagine their sudden removal. Yet beneath this stability lay an unspoken vulnerability. Solomon lived in a nation where slavery was not an anomaly but a foundation, where laws protecting freedom shifted dramatically across state lines. He understood, at least intellectually, that danger existed beyond New York's borders, but like many free black Americans, he believed that documentation and good standing would serve as sufficient protection. The idea that a free man could be stolen outright, stripped of his identity and sold as property seemed too extreme to be plausible within a system that claimed to value law and order. This belief was not foolish. It was the product of lived experience, reinforced by years of moving through the world without chains. Solomon's life in New York was defined by this trust, a trust in routine, in recognition, in the assumption that tomorrow would resemble yesterday. He planned ahead, accepted work opportunities with confidence, and approached new prospects as extensions of his existing life rather than threats to it. The sense of safety he felt was not careless but earned, built over decades of lawful living and social participation. He was not reckless with his freedom, he simply believed it was real. That belief shaped every decision he made, every risk he assessed, every invitation he considered, and it was this deeply rooted assurance that allowed him to move through the world as a man rather than as prey, carrying his violin, his papers, and his sense of self into each new day, unaware that this ordinary freedom, so carefully constructed and fiercely protected, rested on ground far more fragile than he had ever been forced to imagine, a freedom that could vanish not with a warning or a crime, but with a handshake, a promise of work, and the assumption that a free man could never simply be taken, erased, and made to disappear, leaving behind a life in New York that continued for a time in memory alone, waiting for a voice that could no longer answer, a home that held its shape even as its foundation was silently removed, and a name that still belonged to him, even as others prepared to strip it away. The deceptive job offer that led him south arrived not as a threat, but as opportunity wrapped in polite language and friendly confidence, the kind that lowered defenses rather than raising alarms. Solomon Northup encountered two white men who presented themselves as entertainers connected to a traveling show, men who spoke easily, laughed often, and knew how to appear harmless. They praised his skill with the violin, listened attentively as he spoke of his experience, and treated him with a familiarity that suggested equality or at least respect. In a society where black men were so often addressed with suspicion or contempt, their tone alone felt disarming, and Solomon, accustomed to navigating white spaces through professionalism and restraint, saw nothing immediately dangerous in their approach. They spoke of Washington, of lucrative performances, of steady pay for a short period of work, carefully framing the offer as temporary and practical. The timing seemed almost providential. Solomon's life, though stable, was always balanced on labor, and the promise of extra income carried obvious appeal. He considered his family, the expenses of household and children, and the sense of responsibility that pushed him to seize opportunities rather than avoid them. The men emphasized that the work was legal, respectable, and brief, a simple trip south with guaranteed compensation and a prompt return. They asked nothing that seemed unreasonable, demanded no secrecy, and made no effort to rush him into agreement, which only deepened the impression that this was an honest transaction. Solomon did what a careful man would do. He considered the offer seriously, weighed the benefits, and discussed the possibility of travel in terms that reflected trust rather than fear. He gathered his freedom papers, a habitual act that felt sufficient, and prepared himself as he always had when stepping beyond familiar ground. The papers were not an afterthought. They were proof, tangible and official, that his status could not be questioned. He had carried them before, shown them when necessary, and been affirmed by them. In his mind, they transformed any potential danger into a manageable inconvenience, something that law and reason could resolve. The men accompanied him through preparations, maintaining their pleasant demeanor, reinforcing the sense that this was a partnership rather than a risk. They spoke of accommodations, of meals, of schedules, of small details designed to project transparency. Their casual references to travel made the journey feel routine, and Solomon, who had never been treated as property, could not fully imagine what awaited him beyond the abstract knowledge that slavery existed. His understanding of bondage came from history, from stories, from the distant suffering of others, not from a lived fear that it could suddenly claim him. He was a citizen of New York, a free man whose life was documented and witnessed, and the idea that strangers could simply erase that reality seemed implausible. As they traveled, the geography shifted gradually, not abruptly, towns blending into one another, roads stretching longer, accents changing subtly. Solomon noted these changes without alarm, focused on conversation, on plans, on the promise of work ahead. The men continued to behave as companions, sharing food, exchanging stories, presenting themselves as guides rather than captors. Each mile southward felt less like a descent into danger and more like a professional obligation being fulfilled. The familiarity of human interaction masked the power imbalance that would soon become absolute, and Solomon's trust, built over years of lawful living, remained intact. In Washington, the atmosphere felt different, heavier, though not immediately hostile. The presence of slavery was visible here in ways it had never been in New York, but even then Solomon did not feel personally threatened. He was not alone, not undocumented, not wandering without purpose. He was accompanied by men who claimed responsibility for him, and that illusion of protection mattered. They suggested celebration, marking the successful arrival, an evening of drinks to conclude the journey before work began. Solomon, unused to excess but not opposed to social ritual, accepted without suspicion, seeing it as part of the same friendly rapport that had defined the trip. The moment when trust turned into vulnerability was quiet, almost invisible. The drink was offered casually, consumed without hesitation, its effect slow and disorienting. Solomon felt a heaviness he could not immediately explain, a fog creeping into his thoughts, his body responding with weakness rather than alarm. He attempted to steady himself, attributing the sensation to fatigue, or unfamiliar liquor, never imagining that this physical loss of control was intentional. The men watched him closely, their friendliness unchanged on the surface, even as his awareness slipped further away from him. When he lost consciousness, it was not dramatic. There was no struggle, no warning cry, no sudden realization that could be resisted. His trust in the normalcy of the situation worked against him, preventing the instinctive panic that might have arisen under different circumstances. The world narrowed, sounds fading, motion blurring, and when awareness returned, it did so in fragments rather than clarity. Pain came first, sharp and grounding, followed by darkness, then the unmistakable sensation of restraint. Solomon awoke not as a traveler or a worker, but as a captive, his body chained, his clothes replaced, his surroundings unfamiliar and hostile. Confusion dominated his first moments of consciousness. He attempted to speak, to assert himself, to explain the mistake, confident that once the error was recognized, it would be corrected. He declared his name, his status, the existence of his papers, expecting reason to prevail. Instead, his words were met with violence, a response so immediate and brutal that it shattered any remaining belief in misunderstanding. Each attempt to speak the truth was punished, not debated, teaching him with each blow that truth itself had no value here. The men who had traveled with him were gone, replaced by faces hardened by authority and indifference. The setting was unmistakable now, a slave pen, a place designed not for confusion but for control. Solomon's freedom papers were nowhere to be found, their absence as deliberate as his capture. He realized then that the journey had never been about employment, that every step southward had been calculated, every friendly gesture part of a practiced deception, aimed at delivering him into bondage. The trust he had extended, grounded in law and human decency, had been weaponized against him. As hours passed, the reality of his situation pressed down with increasing weight. He was surrounded by others whose fear mirrored his own, men and women whose eyes carried resignation as well as terror. Some whispered, some wept, some stared into nothing, their spirits already bending under the knowledge of what awaited them. Solomon listened, absorbing fragments of their stories, recognizing patterns of loss and betrayal that now included his own. He understood that his kidnapping was not an anomaly but part of a system sustained by lies, profit, and the deliberate targeting of those whose freedom could be stolen with minimal consequence. The offer of work, so ordinary in appearance, revealed itself as a doorway into a hidden economy of human trafficking that thrived alongside respectable institutions. Washington, the seat of government, was not a refuge but a marketplace, and Solomon, a free man only days earlier, had been reduced to merchandise through a combination of trust, deception, and geography. The southward journey had stripped him not only of liberty but of voice, transforming his identity into a liability that had to be suppressed through force. In the hours and days that followed, Solomon replayed every conversation, every decision, searching for the moment when danger might have been visible. He questioned his own judgment, his faith in papers, his belief that freedom once secured could not simply be revoked. Yet even as doubt crept in, a deeper understanding emerged, that the deception had succeeded precisely because it mirrored normal life, because it exploited the habits of a free man who believed that work offers were not traps, and that handshakes did not conceal change. The journey south had not begun with fear, but with confidence, and that confidence, carefully cultivated and then betrayed, marked the true beginning of his descent into slavery, a descent made possible not by ignorance,
but by trust in a system that promised protection while quietly permitting disappearance, kidnapping, chains, and the destruction of his identity unfolded not as a single violent moment, but as a sequence of calculated erasures designed to dismantle Solomon Northup, piece by piece. When he fully awoke inside the slave pen, pain anchored him to the reality of his body, wrists and ankles bound, movement restricted, dignity stripped without ceremony. The walls around him were rough and close, the air thick with the sounds of others breathing, murmuring, crying, all of it confirming that this place existed solely to contain human beings reduced to inventory. His first instinct was reason. He spoke clearly, asserted his name, his birthplace, his status as a free man, believing that identity itself carried authority. He expected confusion, perhaps embarrassment, followed by release. What he encountered instead was fury, as if his words threatened the foundation of the space itself. The man who answered him did not debate or investigate. He reached for a paddle, thick and worn smooth by repetition, and struck Solomon with deliberate force. Each blow was measured, not impulsive, meant to teach rather than simply to hurt. Solomon learned immediately that language no longer functioned as protection. Every declaration of truth invited further punishment. Every insistence on his freedom was treated as defiant. The violence was not chaotic. It was instructional, reinforcing a new rule in which identity was not self-declared, but imposed. The message was clear and repeated until his body understood it, even when his mind resisted. Here, your name is a problem, your past is a lie, your voice is dangerous. They told him he was no longer Solomon Northup. They assigned him the name Platt, a label that severed him from family, history and legal existence in a single stroke. This renaming was not symbolic. It was operational. Names determined value, ownership, destination. To refuse the name was to invite pain. To accept it was to survive. Solomon felt the fracture immediately, the split between who he knew himself to be, and who he was being forced to perform. Each time the new name was spoken, it scraped against his sense of self. Yet he responded, because not responding meant suffering. This was the true beginning of captivity, not the chains alone, but the coerced participation in his own erasure. The chains themselves were constant reminders of his altered status. Heavy iron links bound him during transport, cutting into skin, clinking with every step, ensuring that movement was slow and visible. They transformed simple actions into labor, walking into exertion, standing into endurance. At night the cold of the metal seeped into him, making rest shallow and uneasy. The chains were practical tools, but they were also psychological weapons, signaling to everyone who saw them that he was property, signaling to him that resistance would be immediately contained. Even when removed briefly, their absence felt temporary, as if the metal still hovered just beneath the surface of his skin. Around him, others endured similar transformations. He watched men and women introduced under false names, their origins dismissed, their protests silenced. Some arrived already broken, their eyes dull with resignation. Others clung fiercely to fragments of identity, whispering real names only when they believed no one else could hear. These whispers formed a quiet resistance, a refusal to fully disappear, but they also carried risk. Overseers listened for them, punished them, understood that memory itself could undermine control. Solomon learned quickly to guard his words, to measure every sentence, to speak only when necessary, and even then with caution. The destruction of identity extended beyond names to posture, expression and thought. He was instructed when to stand, when to sit, when to lower his eyes. Eye contact was interpreted as challenge. Silence was often safer than explanation. He learned the rhythms of obedience, the timing of compliance, the subtle ways to appear submissive without surrendering everything internally. This constant self-monitoring was exhausting, a mental labor that ran alongside the physical strain. He could not afford distraction, could not afford to drift into memory too openly, because memory made the present unbearable, and risked betraying him through emotion. Yet, memory persisted. Images of Anne, of his children, of evenings in New York surfaced without permission, sharp and painful. These memories were both refuge and threat. They reminded him of who he was, but they also intensified the horror of what had been taken. He had to learn to contain them, to lock them away during the day, revisiting them only in fragments, often at night, when the darkness offered some concealment. Even then he feared that longing itself might show on his face, that grief might draw attention, that sorrow could be mistaken for insolence. As preparations were made for transport south, Solomon understood that this was not a temporary holding, but a transfer into deeper isolation. The men managing the pens spoke openly of markets, prices and destinations, discussing human beings as commodities without hesitation. Solomon listened, mapping each detail, recognizing that knowledge might one day become leverage. He memorized faces, voices, routes, anything that might anchor him to reality beyond the role he was being forced to play. This act of observation became a quiet form of resistance, a way to remain mentally present even as his circumstances demanded submission. The journey itself further stripped away individuality. Shackled groups moved together, their pace dictated by guards, their interactions limited. Solomon noted how quickly people began to conform, how survival instincts reshaped behavior. Arguments faded, personal stories were shortened, then stopped altogether. Hunger, fatigue and fear compressed life into immediate needs. The farther they traveled, the more distant his former life felt, not because it was forgotten, but because it seemed to belong to another person entirely. He worried not only about being believed if he ever escaped, but about being able to articulate who he had been without sounding like he was describing a stranger. Violence remained a constant possibility, hovering just beneath the surface of every interaction. It did not always arrive, but its potential shaped everything. A raised voice, a delayed response, a misunderstood glance could trigger it. Solomon learned to read moods, to anticipate shifts, to become nearly invisible when necessary. This adaptation felt like betrayal of self, yet he recognized it as necessary. Survival required flexibility, the ability to bend without breaking, to preserve a core identity that could not be expressed openly. By the time he was placed on a ship bound for Louisiana, Solomon understood that kidnapping was not merely the act of taking a body, but the systematic attempt to override a person's internal narrative. The chains, the beatings, the renaming, the enforced silence, all worked together to create a new reality in which the past was dangerous, and the future was owned by someone else. Yet even as the shoreline receded and the unknown stretched ahead, he held on to a single, fragile certainty that the man he had been still existed beneath the imposed name, beneath the iron, beneath the obedience, waiting for a moment however distant, when truth might once again be spoken without punishment, when memory could be reclaimed not as a private burden, but as a weapon against the lie that sought to define him. And in that waiting, in that quiet refusal to fully vanish, his identity endured in tension, strained but unextinguished, suspended between what he was forced to become, and what he knew himself to be, a free man trapped inside a system built to deny that freedom, yet unable to fully destroy it, because destruction required his consent, and consent was the one thing he never truly gave.
Sold into slavery under the name Platt, marked the moment when Solomon Northup's stolen identity was converted into profit, when his existence was reduced to a price, and his future negotiated by men who had never asked his consent. The sale did not begin with spectacle but with routine, the casual efficiency of a system accustomed to moving human beings like goods. He was cleaned, inspected and presented, his body evaluated not for health or comfort but for durability and output. Every gesture directed at him carried an assumption of ownership, as though his past had already been erased so thoroughly that it no longer required acknowledgement. The name Platt followed him everywhere, spoken by traders and buyers alike, repeated until it threatened to sound natural, until it hovered dangerously close to becoming real through repetition alone. In the slave market, Solomon stood alongside others whose fear mirrored his own, each of them waiting to be claimed by strangers. Buyers approached with practiced detachment, asking questions about age, strength, obedience, pretending concern while calculating returns. Solomon watched their eyes, noting how quickly they drifted from faces to shoulders, arms, legs, teeth. His value was assessed in silence, punctuated by brief exchanges between white men who spoke as though he were absent. When he attempted to speak, to assert his true identity, the threat of violence silenced him before words could fully form. The lesson he had already learned in the slave pen was reinforced here. Truth had no currency in this marketplace. The act of sale itself was swift. Money changed hands, a receipt was written, ownership transferred with signatures rather than chains, though chains followed soon enough. The man who purchased him did not look into his eyes for long, offered no acknowledgement of humanity, only instruction. Solomon understood then that he had crossed a boundary more severe than geography, that he was no longer held temporarily but possessed indefinitely. The name Platt was not a placeholder, it was a requirement. Under that name he would live, labor and suffer, his real name rendered dangerous, a liability that could cost him his life if spoken aloud. As he was transported to the plantation, Solomon observed the landscape with the awareness of someone trying to memorize evidence. Rivers, roads, buildings, all were catalogued mentally, not out of curiosity but necessity. He knew that survival depended not only on endurance but on attention, on preserving details that might one day form a path back to himself. Yet each mile deepened the illusion that Platt belonged here more than Solomon Northup ever had. The plantation environment was structured to reinforce this illusion, with routines designed to strip individuality and replace it with function. Upon arrival, he was introduced to overseers and fellow enslaved people not as a man with a history but as an acquisition. Instructions were given about his work, his behavior, his place in the hierarchy. He was warned, explicitly and implicitly, that questioning orders would bring punishment. The name Platt was used as a command shouted across fields, attached to expectations of obedience. Solomon responded to it because refusal meant pain, because silence was safer than correction, because survival demanded compliance. Each response felt like a small theft from himself, yet he weighed those losses against the greater risk of physical harm. The plantation's rhythms quickly asserted control. Dawn dictated waking, bells and voices replacing choice. Labor filled the hours, relentless and unforgiving. The body pushed beyond fatigue, into numbness. Solomon's hands learned new motions, repetitive and punishing, while his mind struggled to stay anchored to memory. He noticed how language shifted around him, how enslaved people referred to themselves and each other through imposed identities, how resistance was often quiet, expressed through glances, pauses, shared understanding rather than open defiance. He learned to listen more than speak, absorbing lessons that had been learned through generations of suffering. The weight of being called Platt extended beyond the spoken word. It shaped expectations, defined punishments, determined worth. When he erred, Platt was blamed. When he succeeded, Platt received no credit beyond continued survival. Solomon's true self became something he carried internally, protected and hidden, emerging only in thought. He feared the erosion of memory, the gradual dulling of detail that could make his past feel imagined rather than lived. To counter this, he recited names, places and dates silently, clinging to them as proof that his former life had been real. Interactions with other enslaved people complicated this struggle. Some accepted Platt without question, seeing no value in a name that invited danger. Others sensed something different in him, an education, a restraint, a watchfulness that set him apart. He had to be careful, balancing authenticity with caution, connection with concealment. Trust was rare and fragile, built slowly through shared hardship rather than word. Even then, the fear of betrayal lingered, not because others were malicious, but because the system rewarded informants and punished solidarity. The plantation owner exercised authority with casual cruelty, enforcing obedience through example rather than constant violence. Though violence was never far away, Solomon learned to anticipate moods, to gauge when silence was safest, when compliance might shield him. He observed how power functioned not only through force but through unpredictability, keeping everyone off balance, uncertain of boundaries. Under this pressure, the name Platt began to feel like armor as well as a wound, a role he could perform to protect the man beneath. Yet moments arose that threatened this fragile separation. Music, when permitted, stirred memories he struggled to contain. The violin, once a symbol of freedom, now became a tool that could bring temporary favor while reopening wounds of loss. When he played, he felt both visible and erased, his talent acknowledged without his humanity being restored. Applause did not translate into respect, it merely confirmed utility. The contradiction sharpened his awareness of how thoroughly the system exploited everything he was, even the parts that had once defined his independence. As months passed, Solomon recognized that being sold under the name Platt was not a single event but an ongoing process. Each day reinforced the fiction that this was who he had always been, that his past had no claim here. The repetition of labor, the enforcement of routine, the constant threat of punishment, all worked together to press him into a shape that fit the plantation's need. He resisted not through open rebellion, which would have been suicidal, but through preservation, guarding his thoughts, maintaining clarity, refusing internally to accept the lie that defined him. In this state suspended between identities, Solomon existed in tension. The world around him insisted he was Platt, a slave with no history beyond purchase. Inside he remained Solomon Northup, a free man wronged by a system that thrived on disappearance. This dual existence demanded constant vigilance, a balancing act between survival and selfhood. Each day tested his ability to endure without surrendering entirely, to perform obedience without internalizing it, to live within the imposed name while refusing to let it overwrite the truth that still pulsed beneath it, a truth carried quietly through fields and night, through exhaustion and fear, waiting for a moment when it might again be spoken aloud without the crack of a whip following close behind. Brutal punishment for claiming his freedom became the primary tool used to silence Solomon Northup whenever the truth threatened to surface, transforming honesty itself into an act of rebellion. From the moment he insisted that he was a free man, violence followed with immediate certainty, as though the mere existence of his past posed a danger greater than any physical resistance. Each time Solomon spoke his real name, or referenced his life in New York, the response was swift and unforgiving, designed not only to cause pain but to condition fear. The men who held power over him understood that his greatest threat was not strength or escape, but memory, and punishment was the method by which they attempted to erase it. The first severe beating left no ambiguity about the rules governing his survival. Tied, restrained, and struck repeatedly, Solomon experienced pain that was calculated rather than chaotic. The blows landed with purpose, aimed at breaking resolve rather than bones, though either outcome would have been acceptable to those delivering. Between strikes, he was warned that speaking of freedom again would lead to worse consequences, that death was not only possible but permitted. The punishment was public enough to serve as a warning to others, reinforcing a shared understanding that claims of freedom disrupted the order of the plantation, and would be crushed without hesitation. Pain became a language he was forced to learn. He learned how many blows accompanied a sentence, how silence could shorten suffering, how compliance sometimes reduced intensity but never eliminated it. The body adapted in small ways, muscles tensing instinctively, breath controlled to avoid cries that might provoke further anger. Yet no amount of physical adaptation could dull the psychological damage of being punished for telling the truth. Each beating created a new conflict within him, between the instinct to assert his identity and the necessity of remaining alive to preserve it. Other enslaved people watched these punishments with a mixture of fear and sympathy. Some avoided him afterward, not out of cruelty but self-preservation, knowing that proximity to defiance could invite suspicion. Others offered quiet gestures of support, glances that acknowledged his suffering without words. They understood the cost of resistance, understood that Solomon's insistence on freedom threatened not only himself but the fragile balance that allowed them to endure another day. This isolation deepened his struggle, forcing him to carry his truth largely alone. Over time the punishments evolved. They were no longer always triggered by open declarations but by perceived attitude, hesitation, or errors interpreted as Solomon learned that even unspoken reminders of his former life, such as posture or tone, could provoke violence. He was expected to perform submission convincingly, to erase not only his words but his manner. This expectation demanded constant vigilance, a reshaping of behavior that felt like a slow suffocation of self. Each day required him to calculate how much of himself could remain visible without attracting punishment. The overseers used violence strategically, alternating between brutality and restraint to keep everyone uncertain. Some days passed without incident, creating a false sense of stability, only to be followed by sudden outbursts that reminded everyone of the underlying Solomon recognized this pattern as deliberate, a way to keep fear alive even in moments of calm. The unpredictability made resistance more dangerous, as there was no clear line between safety and punishment, only shifting moods and arbitrary enforcement. The memory of his family became both refuge and torment during these moments. As his body absorbed blow after blow, his mind fled northward, clinging to images of Anne and his children, to the sound of his violin played freely, to evenings unmarred by fear. These memories sustained him, yet they also intensified the injustice of his suffering. He was being punished not for a crime, but for existing as someone he was not allowed to be. The contrast between who he was and who he was forced to appear as sharpened the pain beyond the physical. Solomon gradually learned when silence was a form of resistance, and when it was surrender. He stopped openly asserting his freedom, not because he doubted it, but because survival demanded patience. This decision carried its own cost, a sense of complicity that weighed heavily on him. Each day he remained silent felt like another day stolen from his true life, another concession to the lie imposed upon him. Yet he understood that death would erase any chance of reclaiming that life, and so he endured, storing his truth internally like punishment also served to remind him of how completely the system relied on terror rather than legitimacy. No document, no witness, no law was invoked against him, only force. The beatings were admissions of weakness, evidence that the institution of slavery could not tolerate truth because truth exposed its illegitimacy. This realization hardened his resolve, even as it constrained his action. He began to see endurance itself as defiance, the act of surviving without internal surrender as a quiet challenge to the power that sought to redefine him. The scars left by these punishments accumulated, visible and invisible. Some faded, others lingered, etched into his body as reminders of the cost of speaking. Each scar carried a lesson, a calculation of risk, a memory of pain that informed future decisions. He learned to endure humiliation alongside violence, to accept unjust blame, to absorb anger meant to assert dominance rather than correct behavior. This endurance was not passive. It required constant strength, the discipline to remain present without reacting, to protect his mind even as his body was attacked. Despite the brutality, moments arose when his captors underestimated him,
mistaking his restraint for submission. In these moments, Solomon observed, learned and planned silently. He listened to conversations, noted names and routines, stored information that might one day matter. Punishment had taught him that open resistance was futile, but it had not extinguished his capacity for strategy. Each beating reinforced the need for patience, for timing, for allies rather than declarations. As years passed, the threat of punishment remained ever present, shaping every interaction. Even when he complied fully, the knowledge that a single misstep could reignite violence never left. This constant tension became a background hum to his existence, a reminder that his body was always at risk, that mercy was conditional and temporary. Yet beneath this fear, his sense of self persisted, bruised but intact, nourished by memory and sustained by the belief that truth, though punished now, still existed independently of those who tried to destroy it. In enduring brutal punishment for claiming his freedom, Solomon learned the true cost of truth in a system built on lies. Each beating stripped away illusions about justice, while reinforcing his understanding of what was at stake. He survived by bending without breaking, by allowing his silence to shield a truth that could not yet be spoken, by enduring pain without allowing it to redefine who he was, carrying his freedom inward when it could not be expressed outwardly, holding it there through suffering and restraint, waiting within the imposed silence for a moment when the truth might again surface without inviting immediate violence, a moment not yet visible but not yet impossible. Survival on Louisiana plantations required Solomon Northup to adapt to a world engineered to exhaust both body and spirit, a landscape where endurance was not admired but demanded, and where every day tested the limits of human resilience. The heat alone reshaped existence, pressing down with a weight he had never known in New York, turning labor into an unbroken confrontation with the elements. Fields stretched endlessly under a sun that offered no mercy, and work began before dawn, continued through midday, and only ended when darkness made further labor impossible. Solomon learned quickly that survival depended on conserving strength, on pacing movements, on understanding how to work efficiently enough to meet expectations without collapsing. The plantations operated on rigid routines enforced by overseers whose authority was unquestioned and often cruel. Bells, whistles, and shouted commands replaced personal choice, dictating when to wake, when to work, when to eat, and when to rest. Solomon observed how these routines stripped away individuality, reducing life to a sequence of tasks repeated day after day. There was no room for spontaneity, no allowance for fatigue or illness, only quotas that had to be met regardless of circumstance. Failure invited punishment, and punishment was not merely corrective but exemplary, designed to reinforce obedience through fear. Food was scarce and calculated, provided not for nourishment but for functionality. Rations were just enough to keep bodies moving, leaving little margin for error. Solomon learned to eat quickly, to value every scrap, to stretch meager portions through patience and restraint. Hunger became a constant companion, dulling senses, sharpening tempers, and making survival a collective struggle. Enslaved people shared what they could, traded favors, and relied on small acts of generosity to make scarcity bearable. These exchanges formed fragile bonds of community, quiet networks of support that existed beneath the watchful eyes of those in power. Sleep offered limited relief. Nights were short, often interrupted by anxiety, by the lingering pain of the day's labor, by the fear of sudden summons or punishment. Solomon learned to rest lightly, to remain alert even in exhaustion, aware that vulnerability carried risk. The quarters where enslaved people slept were cramped and poorly constructed, offering little protection from weather or insects. Yet within these spaces, whispers passed between bunks, stories exchanged in fragments, memories shared cautiously. These moments of human connection became essential to survival, reminders that identity had not been completely erased. The labor itself varied but was always punishing. Cotton picking demanded relentless repetition, fingers raw and bleeding, backs bent for hours. Sugarcane work was even more brutal, the stalks sharp, the pace unforgiving, the harvest season consuming every waking hour. Solomon's body bore the marks of this labor, muscles hardened by necessity, wounds treated with whatever was available, often nothing more than cloth and endurance. He learned to push pain aside, to treat it as background rather than obstacle, because stopping was not an option. Within this environment, Solomon had to navigate relationships carefully. Overseers wielded power unpredictably, some enforcing rules with sadistic pleasure, others maintaining control through cold detachment. Plantation owners varied in temperament, but shared an unquestioned belief in their right to command. Solomon learned to read faces, to anticipate moods, to adjust behavior accordingly. This constant vigilance was exhausting, requiring emotional restraint and strategic silence. He could not afford anger, could not afford honesty, could not afford to draw attention unless absolutely necessary. Fellow enslaved people became both allies and reminders of the system's cruelty. Solomon observed different coping mechanisms, some surrendering inwardly, others resisting quietly through work slowdowns, feigned ignorance, or subtle sabotage. He learned from them, adopting strategies that balanced survival with dignity. There was unspoken instruction in the way they moved, spoke and avoided danger, a collective wisdom passed down through suffering. Solomon, though new to bondage, absorbed these lessons quickly, understanding that survival required humility without self-erasure. Music, once a symbol of freedom, took on a complicated role in plantation life. Solomon's skill with the violin sometimes earned him temporary favor, occasions where he was asked to play for gatherings, providing moments of relief from labor. Yet these moments were bittersweet, as his talent was exploited without acknowledgement of his humanity. Playing music reminded him of his former life while underscoring its absence. The instrument became both a lifeline and a wound, connecting him to who he had been while reinforcing the reality of who he was forced to be. The psychological toll of plantation life was as severe as the physical. The constant threat of violence, the unpredictability of punishment, the erosion of autonomy, all worked together to wear down resistance. Solomon fought this erosion by holding on to routine within routine, by creating small mental rituals that preserved his sense of self. He counted days, marked seasons, recited memories internally, anything to prevent time from dissolving into a blur of labor and pain. These internal acts of resistance were invisible but essential, anchors against despair. Nature itself became both adversary and witness. The swamps, forests, and fields of Louisiana were beautiful in their own way, yet they surrounded suffering indifferent to it. Solomon noticed birds, trees, the changing light, moments of stillness that contrasted sharply with human cruelty. These observations offered brief respite, reminders of a world larger than the plantation, a world not entirely governed by whips and quotas. Yet escape through nature remained a distant dream. The environment, as dangerous as it was vast, patrolled and unforgiving. Illness and injury posed constant threats. Medical care was minimal, often non-existent, and weakness was treated as defiance. Solomon saw people worked through sickness, wounds ignored until they festered, lives shortened by neglect. He learned to conceal pain, to keep moving even when his body protested, because visibility invited punishment rather than care. Survival meant appearing capable at all times regardless of reality. Through all of this, Solomon's determination to endure remained rooted in the knowledge that his captivity was unjust. He did not accept the logic of the system, even as he navigated its demands. Survival was not surrender, it was strategy. Each day lived was another day preserved, another day closer, however imperceptibly, to the possibility of change. He learned to measure hope carefully, to avoid despair without indulging in fantasy, to exist in the narrow space between resignation and rebellion. Life on Louisiana plantations forced Solomon to become something he had never intended to be, a man skilled in endurance, restraint and observation, yet it did not succeed in erasing his humanity. Survival required him to adapt without forgetting, to obey without believing, to live within imposed boundaries while carrying an internal freedom that could not be legislated away. In this sustained act of survival, day after day under the southern sun, among fields that demanded everything and offered nothing, Solomon remained present, attentive and quietly resistant, maintaining a fragile but unbroken connection to the man he had been and the freedom he still claimed as his own, holding on to that connection through exhaustion and fear, through hunger and labor, sustaining it as the core around which survival itself was built.
The constant threat of death and total erasure shadowed Solomon Northup's existence on the plantation, shaping every thought, every movement, every decision with an awareness that survival was never guaranteed, and disappearance was always possible. Death was not rare or dramatic, it was routine, woven into daily life as a warning rather than an exception. People vanished quietly, removed by illness, exhaustion, punishment, or arbitrary violence, their absence noted briefly and then absorbed into the rhythm of labor. Solomon understood that the system did not require his continued existence, only his usefulness, and that the line between the two was thin and easily crossed. Violence functioned as both spectacle and reminder. Whippings were carried out in full view, not only to punish the individual but to instruct everyone else. Solomon watched bodies break under lashes, heard screams cut short by fatigue or loss of actions, saw blood soak into soil already darkened by history. These scenes imprinted themselves deeply, not only through horror but through the lesson they delivered. Survival depended on compliance, and even compliance offered no permanent protection. The randomness of punishment ensured that fear never settled into predictability, keeping everyone alert, tense and aware that death could arrive without warning. Illness carried its own risks. Fever, infection, and injury were common, and care was minimal or non-existent. A sick person was often viewed as defective equipment rather than a human in need of rest. Solomon saw men and women forced to work through sickness until their bodies gave out, after which they were discarded or left to recover on their own if recovery was possible at all. Death from neglect was slow and quiet, offering no dramatic resistance, only the gradual fading of strength until movement ceased altogether. These deaths were rarely acknowledged beyond their impact on productivity. The threat of erasure extended beyond physical death to something more insidious, the disappearance of identity without a body to mourn. Enslaved people were sold, traded, or relocated without notice, separated from families and communities overnight. Solomon watched children torn from parents, spouses divided permanently, names reassigned without regard. These separations were a form of death, the destruction of relational existence, leaving behind living bodies, severed from all that had given them meaning. He understood that his own fate could include such erasure, that even if he survived physically, he could be removed from memory, reduced to a line in a ledger, or forgotten entirely. Solomon lived with the knowledge that any assertion of self could provoke lethal consequence. Speaking back, resisting orders, or even appearing dissatisfied could escalate quickly. He measured his expressions carefully, aware that a glance held too long or a hesitation too noticeable might be interpreted as defiant. This constant self-policing consumed mental energy, turning ordinary interactions into calculated performances. Survival required him to anticipate danger before it fully formed, to retreat inward when necessary, to remain outwardly compliant even as fear tightened its grip. The proximity of death sharpened his awareness of time. Days felt fragile, not guaranteed, each one potentially his last. He learned not to plan far ahead, not to indulge in visions of the future that might never arrive. Instead, he focused on endurance, on getting through the next hour, the next task, the next command. This narrowing of focus was both protective and painful, shrinking life into manageable increments while denying him the comfort of long-term hope. Yet within this narrowed existence, his determination to remain alive took on moral weight, survival itself becoming an act of resistance against a system that expected his eventual disappearance. Witnessing others die left marks that could not be erased. Solomon remembered faces, voices, fragments of stories, carrying them internally as proof that they had existed. These memories became a private archive, a refusal to allow the dead to vanish completely. He feared that if he forgot them, the system would have succeeded not only in killing bodies but in erasing lives. Remembering was dangerous in its own way, deepening grief and anger, yet forgetting felt like complicity. At times despair pressed in with suffocating force. The cumulative weight of loss, fear, and exhaustion threatened to overwhelm his resolve. He recognized moments when the idea of surrendering to fate, of letting go entirely, seemed almost merciful. In those moments, he returned mentally to his former life, not as fantasy but as grounding reality. He reminded himself that he had been free, that this condition was imposed, not deserved, and that acknowledging that truth internally was a way to resist total erasure. As long as he remembered who he was, the system had not fully succeeded. Nature offered little comfort in this context. The same landscape that appeared vast and open also concealed danger, swamps and forests that swallowed those who fled unprepared. The possibility of escape existed, but it was shadowed by the likelihood of capture and death. Solomon understood that attempting escape without preparation or allies could lead not only to his own death but to harsher punishment for others. This knowledge complicated every impulse toward flight, transforming hope into calculation, desire into restraint. The presence of death also altered relationships among the enslaved. Bonds formed quickly under shared suffering, yet everyone knew they could be severed at any moment. Solomon learned to value these connections while accepting their fragility, to offer support without assuming permanence. Grief became communal yet restrained, expressed quietly, often privately because open mourning could be interpreted as disruption. This restraint did not diminish the pain but layered it beneath survival, creating a depth of suffering that rarely surfaced fully. The threat of being killed for reasons unrelated to behavior weighed heavily. An overseer's anger, a misunderstanding, a perceived slight could escalate unpredictably. Solomon saw how power operated without accountability, how life could be taken without consequence. This reality stripped death of moral logic, making it arbitrary rather than meaningful. In such an environment, survival depended not on justice but on navigation, on minimizing exposure to risk without ever eliminating it. Total erasure loomed as the ultimate victory of the system, a state in which Solomon would not only die but be forgotten, his story absorbed into silence. This fear fueled his determination to observe, to remember, to maintain clarity. He committed details to memory, names, locations, behaviors, anything that might one day matter, even if he did not survive. The act of knowing felt like resistance, as though bearing witness internally challenged the lie that his life was insignificant. Living under constant threat forced Solomon to redefine courage. It was no longer loud or visible but quiet and persistent, expressed through endurance rather than confrontation. Courage meant waking each day despite fear, working despite exhaustion, remaining human despite dehumanization. It meant choosing life repeatedly in circumstances designed to make life unbearable. This form of courage rarely received acknowledgement, yet it sustained him through years when death felt close enough to touch. In this environment, hope became a careful practice, rather than an emotion. Solomon allowed himself only measured hope, enough to endure but not enough to shatter him if disappointed. He learned to hold possibility lightly, to exist in the present without surrendering belief entirely. The threat of death and erasure never receded, but neither did his will to pursue. And within that tension he continued to live, carrying memory, identity and awareness forward each day, refusing to disappear completely, even as the system around him worked tirelessly to make him vanish, body and name alike, pressing him towards silence while he held on to existence through endurance, attention and the unspoken certainty that being alive, remembering, and refusing to forget himself was itself a form of survival that defied the ever-present shadow closing in around him. Secret alliances and moments of resistance became the fragile threads that sustained Solomon Northup, amid the unrelenting oppression of the Louisiana plantation. Small but significant acts that allowed him to retain a sense of agency in a world designed to erase it. These alliances were rarely explicit, rarely formal. They were formed in glances, in whispered warnings, in shared knowledge that survival required more than compliance alone. Among the enslaved, trust was precious and dangerous, and Solomon had to learn quickly whom to observe, whom to approach, and whom to avoid. Each decision carried immense weight, for a single misplaced word or misjudged action could trigger punishment, not only for himself but for others, binding survival to discretion as much as to strength. He observed patterns among his fellow enslaved workers, noticing subtle cues of solidarity, the way someone might slow labor just enough to signal exhaustion without drawing the overseer's wrath, the way others shared hidden portions of food, the quiet gestures that indicated empathy without exposure. Solomon internalized these observations, recognizing that resistance did not always mean open confrontation. Survival required a combination of patience, subtlety and intelligence, the ability to read situations accurately and act in ways that preserved safety while asserting selfhood. Each small act of cooperation became a lifeline, a connection that reminded him he was not entirely isolated, even within the system designed to sever human bonds. Conversations, when they occurred, were coded and careful. Names, locations and experiences were shared cautiously, often in whispers during the rare moments when overseers were absent or distracted. Solomon learned to listen as much as to speak, to interpret pauses and gestures as much as words, and to contribute only when it would not expose him or others to immediate danger. These moments of communication were precious, providing emotional sustenance as well as practical knowledge about the rhythms of plantation life. Through this network of careful alliances, Solomon began to understand the ways in which knowledge could function as resistance, a tool as potent as any physical act, and the ways in which silence too could be wielded strategically. Some resistance took the form of observation and memory. Solomon and others quietly recorded the names of overseers, plantation owners, and traders, the timing of shipments and arrivals, the geography of the land and nearby roads. This knowledge was a shield and a potential weapon, a means of preserving identity and agency against a system that sought to render them invisible. Each detail memorized was an act of defiance, an assertion that despite imposed names, chains and labor, they still existed as sentient beings capable of thought, planning and survival beyond immediate subjugation. These hidden acts of intellectual resistance were subtle but powerful, fortifying Solomon's sense of self, even as physical freedom remained unattainable. Moments of overt resistance were rare and fraught with danger, but they occurred nonetheless. Solomon witnessed and sometimes participated in small acts of defiance, from minor work slowdowns to covert expressions of individuality. Each act required calculation, weighing potential consequences against potential benefit. Resistance was never about heroism alone. It was about survival, about maintaining the core of personhood in a place designed to destroy it. Even the smallest victories, a successfully completed day without being overworked, a kind word exchanged, a small act of personal autonomy were significant. They reinforced the understanding that while the system controlled bodies, it could not entirely claim minds and spirit. Religion and shared belief provided another axis of clandestine resistance,
Enslaved people gathered when possible, praying quietly, telling stories and singing songs that carried coded messages. Solomon recognized the power of these gatherings to reinforce solidarity, and to provide a psychological sanctuary where oppression's immediacy could be suspended, even temporarily. These spiritual and communal practices were acts of defiance, asserting the humanity denied by the plantation structure. They reminded participants that their existence had value beyond labor, that they were more than the sum of imposed roles, and that hope could persist even under relentless surveillance. Solomon's skill as a musician occasionally intersected with these alliances. Though performing could be a tool of manipulation by overseers, it also allowed him to build relationships subtly, to gain favor or trust in ways that could be leveraged for protection. He learned to navigate the duality of his talent, using it to survive while resisting its full co-option. Music became a medium through which he maintained connection to identity, memory, and subtle forms of influence, demonstrating that resistance could be creative as well as strategic. Each performance was calculated, a negotiation between survival and self-preservation, a balancing act that underscored the complexity of agency within bondage. Trust was always conditional, tested repeated. Solomon learned to interpret inconsistencies, to detect deception or coercion, and to adjust alliances accordingly. He understood that safety was temporary, and that every action carried risk, but that careful collaboration could produce small advantages, even under the watchful eyes of the enslaver. He became skilled at reading the intentions of both fellow enslaved people and overseers, anticipating threats and identifying opportunities for quiet intervention or aid. This perceptiveness was not innate but developed under necessity, a survival skill honed by observation, experience, and the ever-present threat of punishment. Communication extended beyond the immediate plantation whenever possible. Solomon witnessed attempts to send messages, either verbally or through intermediaries, to inform free black communities or sympathetic whites of his condition. These actions were perilous, yet they reflected an understanding that solidarity could transcend individual plantations, connecting him to networks of resistance that were larger than his immediate surroundings. Each successful transmission of information was a minor triumph, reinforcing the principle that bondage could not fully isolate him, that connections could exist even in confinement, and that knowledge could serve as leverage for eventual liberation. Moments of resistance, both secret and subtle, required careful timing. Solomon learned to gauge the moods of overseers and owners, to identify windows of opportunity where risk was minimal, and to act decisively within them. These moments were fleeting, sometimes imperceptible to outsiders, yet they carried profound significance for those involved. Each act was a claim to agency, a refusal to be fully defined by chains and labor, a statement that identity, memory, and intellect could not be erased, even in a system designed to suppress them. Resistance became a discipline, practiced daily, often silently, always strategic. The psychological dimensions of these alliances were as important as the physical ones. Sharing knowledge and supporting each other created a network of mutual reassurance, a mental scaffolding that allowed individuals to endure the relentless pressures of plantation. Solomon recognized that survival depended on this social infrastructure, that it was as critical as food, water, or shelter. In moments of despair, the presence of another who understood, who communicated through subtle signs, who shared the burden of fear and vigilance, provided the strength to continue. These bonds were fragile, easily broken, yet essential, offering a reminder that humanity persisted even under systematic oppression. Through these secret alliances and acts of resistance, Solomon maintained a sense of identity and possibility. Each carefully nurtured connection, each calculated gesture of defiance, each covert observation or message preserved his sense of self and created openings for survival. Resistance in this context was not always heroic or dramatic. It was strategic, patient, and deeply necessary. It allowed him to endure the relentless demands of the plantation while maintaining an internal assertion of agency, a quiet but persistent refusal to accept total erasure. These moments, small though they were, stitched together the fragile continuity of Solomon Northup's humanity, providing a foundation upon which hope, survival, and eventual liberation could be built. The relentless mental and physical torture Solomon Northup endured on the Louisiana plantations tested every facet of his being, forcing him to confront fear, grief, and despair daily while finding ways to preserve sanity and hope. Every day presented a calculated combination of physical exhaustion and psychological oppression, designed to crush the spirit as effectively as the body. Labor was unending, repetitive, and punishing, structured not merely to extract productivity but to enforce a relentless reminder of subjugation. Each field, each crop, each tool, each command functioned as a mechanism of control, binding bodies into cycles of endurance, while systematically denying the individual's autonomy. And yet Solomon learned that survival required more than physical resilience. It demanded mental acuity and emotional fortitude. He discovered that the mind could serve as both sanctuary and battlefield. Memories of his family, of freedom, of past accomplishments, became vital lifelines, yet they also carried pain, a constant reminder of what had been stolen. To dwell too long on these memories risked despair. To suppress them entirely risked the erasure of identity. Solomon developed strategies to balance remembrance with practicality, to draw strength from memory without allowing grief to immobilize. He recited facts, dates, names and places internally, creating a mental ledger that anchored him to a past that the system sought to erase. This internal discipline became a lifeline, a mental fortitude as crucial as any physical skill. Isolation compounded the pressure. The enforced separations from friends and family created a sense of profound loneliness. Fellow enslaved people could offer companionship, shared knowledge and minor acts of solidarity, but trust was always constrained by necessity and fear. Conversations were coded, gestures, subtle, alliances fragile. Solomon learned to navigate these relationships with care, cultivating connection while avoiding exposure to betrayal. Each interaction was a negotiation between emotional need and the demands of survival, and misjudgment could trigger punishment not only for him but also for those who extended trust. These constraints created a mental tension that never fully relaxed, a constant calculation of risk against the need for human contact. The threat of violence was omnipresent. Solomon witnessed frequent and brutal punishment, whippings, beatings, and the occasional execution intended to maintain order through terror. These incidents were not random but instructive, signaling to all the consequences of perceived insolence or resistance. He observed how overseers wielded power with precision, learning which actions, expressions or moments of hesitation could provoke punishment. This knowledge shaped every gesture, every word, every mental agility became as important as physical stamina. Survival depended on anticipating danger before it materialized and adjusting behavior accordingly. Physical pain, while constant, intersected with psychological torment in ways that intensified both. Cuts, burns, blisters, and lacerations accompanied long hours of labor under the harsh Louisiana sun. Food was inadequate, sleep was limited, and illness went untreated. The body's exhaustion magnified mental stress, while fear and despair intensified physical perception, making the heat hotter, the lash sharper, the workload heavier. Solomon learned to compartmentalize pain, to endure it without allowing it to dominate thought, a skill essential for continued survival. Yet each day left cumulative marks, reminders that endurance was finite, and that each moment required deliberate management of both body and mind. Hope had to be measured and disciplined. Solomon could not afford fanciful dreams of immediate escape which might provoke despair when unrealized. Instead, he cultivated a cautious, persistent hope, grounded in observation, strategy, and careful planning. He studied patterns of movement, routines of overseers, weaknesses in the plantation system, and opportunities for communication. These observations became the foundation for potential escape, a long-term plan built incrementally from small acts of awareness and patience. Hope, therefore, was not a luxury but a strategic necessity, maintained carefully to prevent despair while motivating endurance. Communication played a crucial role in survival and resistance. Solomon learned to read subtle cues, gestures, and expressions both from fellow enslaved people and from overseers. He observed patterns in behavior, noting times of lax oversight, shifts in mood, and possibilities for covert interaction. He exchanged information sparingly, ensuring that nothing shared could endanger himself or others. These acts of mental agility were another form of resistance, asserting his agency in a context designed to suppress it, and preserving the possibility of connection and coordination without attracting lethal attention. Psychological resilience was reinforced by small ritual repetition, memorization, and disciplined thought allowed Solomon to maintain a coherent sense of self. Amid chaos, he would mentally recount details of his life, practice skills, and rehearse conversations, exercises that reinforced identity and autonomy. These rituals were invisible to those around him but crucial for maintaining hope and sanity. They served as private affirmations of his existence as Solomon Northup, the free man, even while performing the imposed identity of Platt before overseers and strangers. Through these practices he preserved continuity of self, resisting the mental erasure that slavery demanded. Social dynamics among the enslaved created both challenges and support systems. While camaraderie could provide emotional and practical aid, tensions were inevitable due to the pressures of scarcity, fear, and survival. Solomon had to navigate these dynamics with sensitivity, balancing empathy with self-preservation. He observed and learned from others' strategies, noting the ways people communicated, shared resources and avoided danger. Cooperation, even in small forms, created resilience, reinforcing psychological endurance, by demonstrating that isolation was not total and that community, however constrained, could exist even in the most oppressive circumstances. The physical environment shaped mental states as well. Swamps, rivers, forests, and open fields were simultaneously sources of threat and subtle refuge. Nature's beauty occasionally offered fleeting solace, moments of aesthetic or spiritual reprieve that contrasted sharply with brutality. Yet the same terrain was a constant reminder of limitations, the dangers inherent in attempting escape, the vigilance required to survive. Solomon's awareness of geography, seasons and natural cues became a tool for survival, another aspect of the strategic mental framework he built to endure. The land itself became both opponent and ally, shaping each decision about movement, labor and observation. Fear was a constant, but Solomon learned to manage it without letting it dominate thought. Anticipation of punishment, illness, death, or betrayal required vigilance, yet excessive fear could paralyze action and invite mistakes. He developed a careful balance, acknowledging danger while maintaining control over emotional response. This disciplined fear management was crucial for endurance, enabling him to navigate daily life effectively without succumbing to despair. Mental control became as important as physical control, a prerequisite for maintaining health, performance and the ability to plan for eventual liberation. Solomon also grappled with the moral complexity of endurance. Acts of self-preservation sometimes required complicity, small concessions that preserved life while feeling like betrayal of principle. He learned to weigh immediate survival against longer-term values, making decisions that sustained existence without entirely surrendering conscience. This ethical negotiation was part of psychological resilience, a continuous recalibration that preserved dignity within constraint. Survival demanded constant vigilance, calculation and the ability to make decisions under extreme stress, cultivating a form of intelligence that combined pragmatism with moral awareness. Endurance on the plantations therefore was multifaceted. It encompassed the physical, the mental, the emotional and the ethical. Solomon's capacity to survive was not merely a function of strength, but of strategy, observation, restraint and subtle assertion of agency. He maintained an internal resistance to erasure, a continuity of identity that functioned as a private rebellion. This endurance allowed him to navigate daily labor, punishment, isolation and constant danger, while preserving hope, maintaining relationships, and accumulating knowledge necessary for eventual freedom. In every day survived, in every calculated act of restraint or observation, Solomon sustained not only his life, but also the essence of who he was, holding on to the possibility that one day, the truth of his existence, might be restored and witnessed beyond the confines of the plantations that sought to destroy him.
The eventual planning and execution of Solomon Northup's escape demanded careful observation, patience, and a calculated accumulation of knowledge, each step informed by years of forced endurance and quiet resistance, every detail scrutinized for potential leverage. Escape was not a momentary impulse but a meticulously considered endeavor, born from the understanding that even minor miscalculations could result in death, severe punishment, or permanent erasure. Solomon had learned through observation of both the enslaved and their overseers, how the plantation operated when routines shifted, which individuals could be trusted, and how the larger system of slavery moved with both rigidity and gaps. Each insight became a tool, a potential key to freedom if wielded carefully. The first stage of escape planning involved mental mapping of the environment. Solomon memorized the geography surrounding the plantation, the layout of fields, the positions of buildings, the patterns of guards' patrols, the locations of rivers, forests, and roads that could serve as routes of flight. This knowledge was critical, for the terrain itself could either protect or doom him depending on how it was used. Each detail, every fence, tree line and crossing was catalogued and rehearsed in the mind, creating an internal blueprint for potential movement. His observations extended beyond the immediate plantation to nearby settlements and transport points, noting habits, timing and vulnerabilities that could be exploited when the moment arrived. Trust, however, remained the most delicate element of planning. Solomon understood that alliances were both vital and precarious, that the wrong confidant could betray him for favor, reward, or out of fear. Relationships with fellow enslaved people required careful cultivation, subtle testing, and ongoing evaluation. He observed the behaviors of those around him, discerning character and reliability through interactions, shared work, and the unspoken codes that govern survival. He learned to communicate indirectly when necessary, using gestures, tones, and insinuations to convey understanding without exposing intentions to potential overseers. Each interaction was a test, each assessment potentially altering the parameters of the escape plan. Observing the behaviors of the enslavers themselves was equally essential. Solomon noted not only the routines but the personalities, tendencies, and weaknesses of owners, overseers, and drivers. Patterns of absence, distraction, or negligence became opportunities. Moments when vigilance waned could be exploited to move unseen or gain access to resources. He recorded timing, sequences of activity, and rares to deviations, all mentally catalogued as potential advantage. Understanding how authority functioned, where it was strongest and where it could be anticipated to falter, was as critical to his survival and planning as knowledge of geography or allies. Physical preparation was an ongoing, silent process. Solomon conditioned his body to endure not only the immediate demands of labor, but the potential strains of flight. He maintained strength, agility, and stamina, practicing movements discreetly whenever possible, knowing that the moment of escape would require more than mental acuity. Subtle endurance routines, careful observation of how the body responded to fatigue, and improvisation with limited nutrition were all part of a strategy to ensure he could sustain movement under adverse conditions. The plantation's labor became both a constraint and an inadvertent training ground, pushing him to adapt under extreme conditions. Timing was critical. Solomon understood that a successful escape required choosing a moment when risk was minimized and opportunity maximized. He weighed seasons, weather, and routines, assessing when visibility might be reduced, when guards would be distracted, and when external conditions might aid concealment or travel. He observed the flows of movement, both of people and of transportation systems, noting the patterns of shipments, river traffic, and local activity. Each factor influenced his mental timeline, a decision matrix constantly refined through observation and experience. The interplay of these variables demanded patience, for acting too early could mean capture and punishment. Acting too late could forfeit opportunity entirely. Resource management added complexity. Solomon identified what provisions could be secured: food, clothing, tools, without raising suspicion. He stored mental and physical reserves, calculating consumption and rationing, preparing for contingencies without attracting attention. Every item carried a dual purpose: necessity and concealment. Even his physical appearance was managed, balancing the need to appear compliant with the requirements of mobility and survival outside the plantation. These preparations were discreet, often imperceptible, yet essential for the execution of the escape plan. Mental rehearsal became a vital component. Solomon envisioned every step, anticipating obstacles and reaction. He imagined crossing rivers, avoiding patrols, seeking assistance, and navigating the broader terrain. This rehearsal included both best-case and worst-case scenarios, equipping him with strategies to adapt on the fly. By internalizing the plan, he reduced the risk of hesitation or error under pressure. These mental exercises reinforced confidence while managing fear, converting anxiety into preparedness, and allowing him to approach the eventual moment of action with a combination of courage and pragmatism. Communication with potential allies outside the immediate environment required exceptional discretion. Solomon had to identify trustworthy contacts, free black individuals, sympathetic whites, or intermediaries without exposing himself to betrayal. These communications, often indirect and coded, involved enormous risk, as discovery could result in severe punishment or fatal consequences. Yet they were indispensable, offering knowledge, assistance, or the possibility of guidance once he had navigated the immediate terrain. The network of information and trust extended beyond the plantation, linking him to a broader system of human solidarity that operated quietly but decisively. The psychological dimension of planning was as significant as the physical and logistic. Solomon had to maintain hope without allowing overconfidence or despair to dominate, managing fear and anticipation in equal measure. He understood that hesitation or panic could be fatal, and that discipline of thought was a prerequisite for any successful escape. Maintaining clarity, composure, and presence of mind under the constant surveillance and threat of violence required a sustained exercise of self-control honed over years of captivity. Each day spent enduring labor and observing routines reinforced both his practical skills and his psychological readiness. Even as the plan took shape, Solomon was acutely aware that escape did not end with leaving the plantation. The journey beyond required navigation, resourcefulness, and continued vigilance. Knowledge of geography, behavior of local populations, and potential sources of aid became increasingly important. He imagined contingencies for capture, illness, injury, and deprivation, building mental strategies to adapt to unforeseen challenges. Every step was embedded within a larger vision of freedom, a distant goal that demanded incremental preparation and unbroken focus. The interplay between patience and action defined the entire process. Solomon understood that a premature move could destroy the possibility of freedom, yet indefinite delay risked losing opportunity or being moved elsewhere. Timing, observation, preparation, and mental discipline converged, creating a framework within which escape became conceivable rather than impossible. He balanced the tension between urgency and caution,
cultivating a readiness that would allow decisive action when the moment arrived, and ensuring that his accumulated knowledge, endurance and alliances could be leveraged to full effect. In this meticulous orchestration of movement, observation and internal discipline, Solomon Northup's escape emerged not as a single act of courage but as the culmination of years of survival learning and strategic planning. Every observation made, every alliance cautiously nurtured, every detail memorized, every physical skill maintained contributed to a coherent strategy aimed at reclaiming freedom. The process was both practical and psychological, combining knowledge of terrain, people, routines and self with disciplined hope and courage. Each moment of preparation reinforced the reality that freedom could be approached methodically, that agency could be reclaimed incrementally, and that even under relentless oppression, careful planning and quiet resistance could create a pathway toward liberation, a possibility that required patience, courage and unwavering attention to detail. Sustained over years of captivity and exploitation, Solomon Northup's story does not end with mere survival. It culminates in a triumph of human resilience, courage and the unbreakable assertion of identity against a system designed to erase it. His eventual liberation stands as a testament to the power of patience, intelligence and moral fortitude. Every small act of observation, every hidden alliance, every disciplined thought and silent resistance contributed to that moment when freedom was finally within reach. It was not luck that delivered him from bondage, but the accumulation of years spent learning, enduring and strategizing, proving that even in the darkest circumstances the human spirit can reclaim what oppression seeks to destroy. Northup's escape changed history because it provided a rare first-hand account of the inner workings of slavery from a man who had lived both as a free citizen and as an enslaved person. His narrative illuminated the horrors, injustices and daily survival tactics that enslaved people endured, giving voice to countless others whose stories were silent. More than a personal victory, his liberation became a beacon, inspiring awareness, empathy and action, demonstrating that courage paired with careful strategy could overcome even the most oppressive system. Ultimately, Solomon Northup's life reminds us that freedom is never simply granted. It is fought for, preserved through endurance and defended through unwavering self-belief. His story embodies the triumph of identity, memory and hope over cruelty, showing that even in circumstances designed to destroy the soul, the human spirit can endure, resist, and ultimately reclaim its rightful place.